The man who could buy silence with a glance was not immune to a word. On a sun-slick sidewalk, where the city leaned against glass and polished shoes, Yasmin laughed in a way that sounded like a verdict. A janitor bent over a rusting trash bin, his back a map of small labors. A broom rested against his shoulder like an old companion. He moved with the invisible rhythm of those who keep other people's worlds clean. Yasmin stepped close, stilettos clicking like punctuation, and said something that landed like a stone. "Don't touch me with that," she said, loud enough for the table behind them to freeze. "You stink." There was a small hush. The city's breath stalled. The janitor's shoulders didn't twitch. If shame can find a body and make it smaller, he carried himself as if it couldn't. A child at a cafe table looked up, confused, then looked away. A waiter swallowed and set a plate down. Yasmin's friends smiled like small, loyal flags. The man watching from the tinted glass of a sedan rolled down his window only enough to hear. His name was Tiago. He had the sort of face people remembered in two ways: the one that commanded rooms, and the one that rested most evenings beside his daughter as they counted stars. He had watched Yasmin before. He had seen her sharpen her tongue, saw it slice at housekeepers, at attendants, at the small people who made her life seamless. He had not always listened. Power has a way of tuning out the things it doesn't need to hear. But power can also magnify the small private details that threaten what it loves. And he loved Sophia. Sophia was 7 years old and carried a ruler of certainty around her neck like a locket. Bedtime stories, crooked thumb sucking when the day had been too loud, the way she insisted on pressing her forehead to Tiago's chest to find his heartbeat before sleep. She had a laugh like a bell. She liked making little drawings of the garden and putting them in envelopes for no one. When she said, "Daddy, make it better," she meant it in the small room where bedtime is a castle and a promise. He thought of that word, stink, landing near her like a seed. He imagined it growing into something that would change Sophia's landscape, the voice she would take into the world, the example of someone who made people invisible. Love makes odd geometries. Tiago's love bent toward protection until it became a plan. That night, after tucking Sophia in and watching her drift, he sat alone in an office with a skyline bleeding neon into the curtains. He could summon half the city with a phone call. He could move men with histories and erase debts with a check. For days the same scenes repeated in his head. Yasmin, in her gleaming ease, flinging dignity like confetti for herself, and contempt for anyone in an apron. He remembered a young cleaner, Rosa, who had been humiliated at a charity gala, and who later stopped coming into work. He remembered a salon attendant who had been laughed at until she cried, and the manager, embarrassed, found a reason to dismiss her the next week. Those were small things, but they were not nothing. The decision did not feel like triumph. It felt like an ache that demanded a root. He would disappear for a while, he decided. Not truly gone, but absent in the way a shadow leaves a room. He would learn what his daughter would see if she grew up in a house where the woman beside her held disdain for the people outside that house. He would see if Yasmin's cruelty was consistent across the privileges that sheltered her. He would do it in the one way he could still imagine, as someone invisible. The choice made the air thin. He told himself the plan in practical sentences that had been honed for other kinds of business. A trip, a week, then another, a disguise. He would live as one of those people whose faces the city forgets. He would watch. He would record. He would return with a truth he could not ignore. He did not tell Sophia everything. He told her there were work meetings in other places. Sometimes he kissed her more fiercely than usual and whispered, "I'll be back before the next moon, Princessa." He left small notes in her lunchbox and tiny paper boats with jokes folded inside. Sophia put them in her pocket like treasures. He trusted Marta, his daughter's nanny, with what needed to be true, that Sophia was seen every hour she was awake, that no one would endanger her. He trusted Marta as one trusts a lighthouse, steady and reliable, not as one trusts a hired hand. Marta had been with the family for 5 years. She kept inventories of Sophia's pajamas and had a gentle method for knitting the child back together when she fell apart. Marta's hands remembered the exact pressure to stop a fever and the right rhythm to hum when nightmares came. She was not a woman who listened for gossip. She listened for breath. She had come from a town where people learned how to stand up and take a life home in their pockets. She had saved Tiago's daughter once from choking on a biscuit with a swift scoop of muscle and a calm voice. He owed her something untranslatable. Before he left, he sat with Marta in the kitchen, where the light fell like slow honey through the window. He told her something true and not everything, that he needed her to watch over Sophia more carefully than usual. He told her to suspend habits that involved trusting strangers. Marta's expression did not change the way a weather map never changes the weather. She nodded, her eyes sharpened. "It will be fine," she said. But it was not the kind of fine that begs the listener to relax. It meant, "I will hold this." When he walked through the house before he left, he made notes in his head like a man checking the locks on a vault. Sophia's drawings were on the fridge, magnets like small flags. He pocketed one, a tiny house with a tree. He would carry it under his shirt. A little anchor. He left instructions: the gardener to tend the herb patch, the chef to avoid new menus for a week, the driver to be on standby. He did not tell them about Yasmin. He did not need witnesses for that. On the surface, his absence was a business trip. Boardrooms, partner meetings, a charity gala that was, ironically, a perfect alibi. Under the surface, he moved into a smaller skin. When he cut his hair and put on work clothes, it felt like ritual. He took a uniform, a janitor's uniform, rolled sleeves, a cap, and with that, he folded into anonymity. He grew a beard that could pass. His eyes, which were quick and used to being read, learned to rest somewhere behind a face that was meant to be ignored. He did not add notes about how to do it. He understood the limits of his own methods. The point wasn't to show others how to spy. The point was to feel what the invisible feel. He took a small device with him, a recording device, not explained in manuals or put on display like a trophy. It was a narrative tool, nothing more, a way for memory to be clearer than a single mind's recall. He asked a trusted aide to keep it secure. Never mind the path he had taken to get it. In his head, the ethics were simple. If the truth could guard his daughter, it would be used. After the first night in his rented room above a laundromat, he walked the city as if he were its shadow. He swept a stoop for shelter money. He changed the evening routine at the condominium so that he would bump, in random and careful ways, into Yasmin. He learned places she frequented and the cadence of her laughter at a distance. The first days were a calendar of small hits. Her ignoring a busker, a cold word to a parking attendant, a hair toss with disposable disdain. Each hit landed like a small stone into a glass of water and made concentric ripples in him. At the gym, Yasmin held the mirror like a lover. She measured people in the room as extension of her audience. A trainer, Marco, introduced himself with easy professionalism, asking about goals and cadence. Yasmin dismissed him. "Just run where I tell you to," she said, voice silk over iron. She corrected a young receptionist with a look so sharp it made her hands still. Later, the receptionist would post her resignation to avoid more eyes like those. Tiago watched and felt a private hollow. These were not isolated bites. They were patterns. At a small restaurant where the plates were steady and the staff spoke a language seasoned in respect, Yasmin and Felipe arrived like royalty. The waiter, Luisa, suggested a dish. Yasmin tasted it, smirked, and told the chef her flavor palette was delicate and that the dish was laughable. She sent the plate back and told the staff, as if by accident, that people like her did not expect to see this level of food in such a place. Luisa's face reddened with the slow burn of humiliation. Later, Luisa lost shifts after a manager cited incompatibility with high-level clientele. Little fissures became firmer. Tiago noticed them. He recorded because he could not trust even his most honest feelings. Memory can be a traitor. Anger amplifies. Softness blurs edges. He wanted to return with evidence that did not depend on his interpretation. He wanted to show what it looked like when a woman, celebrated and polished, folded the world around her into an audience that reinforced her worst habits. The city, in the early days, seemed to conspire in revealing its faces. The salon where Yasmin had her hair colored smelled like chemical rain and privilege. She leaned back and told the stylist every private opinion, as if the chair were a confessional and the stylist a priest. "I don't like people who smell like back alleys," she said, and the stylist laughed like someone given permission to be small. The stylist looked at his hands after she left, and his fingers trembled for a while. Tiago carried each image like a new bruise. He could have confronted Yasmin directly at any point. He could have dismissed her quietly, moved the family away, removed Sophia from the orbit entirely. He thought about force and found it messy. Protection is not always separation. Sometimes protection is the refusal to let toxicity continue in silence. There were nights when the disguise felt like a lie he could not live with. He lay awake on the rented cot thinking of Sophia's small, certain hands. He thought about what it would mean if she grew up thinking small cruelties were normal. He thought about Marta humming as she braided Sophia's hair. He thought about the cost of telling the truth in public, the collateral damage it would cause. Jobs lost, reputations broken, people hurt. And he wondered whether he had the right to decide that cost for others. The days moved in a montage. He swept floors and pushed trolleys. He learned to keep his hands busy so his mind wouldn't betray him by growing soft. At a soda stand, Yasmin sneered at the vendor's coins, telling friends a story of how she had once rescued herself from a taxi full of smell. In the condo lobby, she shifted her weight when a maintenance man, Alessandro, asked for directions, and then, in a tone that made him small, corrected him on his own building. On a wet afternoon, she pointed at a woman who had tripped, laughed, and said, "Clumsy people make me anxious. I don't mix with them." Tiago kept the recordings, but he also kept his hands empty in a way that betrayed the violence they could do. He had learned brutality and how it works. He had learned power's appetite. He was not there to feed it. He wanted a verdict, but not vengeance disguised as justice. Marta felt the change in the household first, as an absent weight. She arranged Sophia's clothes and set them out with care. She made extra cups of tea, told the chef to simmer the soups a few minutes longer, mended a shirt as if mending could stitch time. She noticed small things. A package that had been left unopened. A call that came and went unanswered. A driver who waited in a car by the gate until midnight and then left. She missed Tiago's presence in the way a song misses its chorus. On the 10th day, an incident made the pattern jagged and real. It was a small charity luncheon at a trendy hotel, an event where people wore compassion like jewelry, and speakers spoke about giving back in rehearsed cadences. Yasmin found these events like a stage. She orbited the room, the center of her own gravity. A charity organizer introduced a volunteer who used to clean the same hotel. He spoke about how dignity in work matters, and how laughter has a place that does not belong to derision. Yasmin at the table rolled her eyes. After the speeches, the reception moved to a terrace where the champagne flutes clicked like a chorus. The terrace overlooked the river, and lights shone like a city of tiny torches. A waitress, tired from a long shift, accidentally brushed Yasmin's white dress with a tray. The glass nearly slipped. Yasmin turned as if a pet had barked in her ear. "Watch it," she said, clipped and public. The tray clattered into a low table, and a guest, someone who liked being seen with Yasmin, smiled in the way that fills in companionship. The waitress apologized, voice small. Yasmin laughed in a way that made the apology feel like a mistake. Then Felipe, standing nearby, leaned in and said something loud enough so everyone could hear. "Some people don't belong in our circles." It was an easy cruelty, the kind that folds the room into an agreement. Tiago watched the waitress slink away. Later she would lose a shift for clumsiness. Tiago felt each firing like a personal failure. He could have stopped it there. He could have followed the waitress afterward and given restitution, or the kind of consolation that reorders a life. Instead, he ran the scenario through his mind and thought of what would happen if Sophia heard that voice and said, "Isn't that like your friend?" He imagined the world not as it would be for him, but for her. On the 14th day, it escalated into something that would not be contained as humiliation alone. It became spectacle. Yasmin arrived at the hotel pool party wearing a dress like armor. People cultivated attention there. Perfect hair, the right laugh, sunglasses like shields. A young pool cleaner, Raphael, moved along the deck, clearing leaves and debris, work so clean it was invisible unless it failed. He was the sort of steady presence that disappeared into the horizon of a city's service class. Yasmin stepped into his path, toward a chaise she had claimed as territory. "That deck smells," she said without looking. "It's like a dock. The class of these places is slipping." The words were not about pure aesthetics. They were a claim. To a small crowd, she held up a mirror that reflected only her. Raphael, used to work and not to being noticed by the wealthy, except when correction was due, smiled politely, asked if she needed service. Yasmin's laugh cut through. "Do you have a towel for real guests, or only for cleaners?" The friends around her tittered. Someone snapped a picture on a phone. Felipe clapped like a man confirming a joke he did not invent, but is happy to repeat. Raphael's shoulders stiffened, and in a movement that was nothing dramatic, he reached for a bucket and moved away. He had bills to pay and a child to feed. He would not ask for charity. He would not demand respect. Later that week, he would find a memo in the staff room, reductions in payroll due to client preferences. The worst came like a wave an hour later, when a guest, an influencer with a camera, mistook Raphael's water bucket for an accessory, and, with a half-hearted grin, flicked a glass at him to see what would happen. The water splashed over Raphael's shirt. Laughter erupted. It was petty, ignoble, and public. Raphael did nothing, his face a study in patience. The footage would circulate later that night, the clip small and sharp, the caption merciless. Tiago watched the clip like a man watching a wound. He could feel the sting as if it were his own. He had expected cruelties. He had not expected the way his stomach would twist when he thought of his daughter hearing laughter like that and associating it with the people she loved. That night, when he reviewed footage in the small room above the laundromat, the device he carried captured more than he wanted. It caught looks. It caught the flicker of joy in faces like Felipe's, the casual cruelty in a smirk. It caught Yasmin's voice when she told someone, "They have no idea how to act when someone like me is around." The camera had no morals. It only preserved what happened. He counted days on a small calendar he kept beside the cot. 1, 2, 3, until 21. He had given himself 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, he told himself, he would know whether the person who would be present in his daughter's life had a character that could be trusted. He told himself it was about more than social manners. It was about empathy, about how power is used. 3 weeks stretched like an old rope. There were nights when he wanted to reveal himself, to say, "I watched you and I won't let you near Sophia." There were nights when he wanted to leave quietly, to take Sophia to a place where kindness was a requirement. He wondered if the test itself was cruel, if hiding truth for the sake of getting truth was fair. In the household, Marta kept a discreet watch. She noticed the way Yasmin rearranged Sophia's toys in a tidy, almost sterile way, as if she preferred a child's room to look like a curated exhibit. Yasmin would pluck a drawing from the fridge and comment, "Sweet, but primitive." She would explain educational philosophies to Marta, with the assurance of someone lecturing a novice. Marta noted these things, and filed them away like seeds in winter. On the 17th day, everything changed in a single moment. Sophia had an after-school recital at a small studio in the neighborhood. She practiced a little song about the moon, and practiced bowing with a solemn, earnest face. Marta stood in the back, her arms folded like a fence, watching. Yasmin arrived late, with perfume in her wake, and a smile calibrated to 1,000 faces. She took a seat in the first row like she owned the front of life. When Sophia walked on stage, singing haltingly, Yasmin clapped too loudly and then laughed at one of the children's outfits. It was a little thing, a tilt of a head that made a joke of the ordinary. After the recital, parents gathered with coffee and small talk. A young tutor, Livia, mentioned a new method of teaching that helped shy kids project voice. Yasmin, who had been in the conversation only to be seen, scoffed. "Those methods are for people who can't pull themselves together. We don't have time for weakness," Yasmin said. It was a small war on the idea of patience. Then a man with a camera, a freelance photographer named Daniel, asked Yasmin if she would pose with Sophia for a quick photo. It was an awkward, public request. Yasmin's face shifted, like someone revealing a currency. She agreed, smiling the way one smiles when one expects admiration. The photo was taken. Yasmin adjusted Sophia's hair with a small, dismissive gesture. It was meant to be invisible, but the room watched. The photo went online later that night, with Yasmin in the center and Sophia framed like a prop. Comments arrived within an hour. Praise, some jealousy, a few snide remarks about children's fashion. A minor storm. Then something worse. In a small video posted by the photographer, Yasmin casually brushed past a woman, Donna Clara, who had been cleaning the studio floor. Yasmin said, loud enough to be heard, "Watch your step. You're making the place look less desirable." She laughed, the laughter that sounds like a blade. Donna Clara's face reddened. She said nothing and brushed her hands on her apron. This was not just a pattern anymore. It was a string of moments that, when threaded together, made a tapestry. For Tiago, who watched from a distance, it alarmed him not because one woman was cruel, but because those cruel pieces would be the scaffolding Sophia would see and learn from. He thought about how children emulate. He thought about the small contagions of contempt. Marta, moving through the afternoon rituals, noticed a message on Tiago's phone that had been left open on the kitchen counter before he left. A short, practical note about schedules, nothing else. She covered it with a dish towel and went about making tea. Later, at bedtime, Sophia asked about the calendar and whether Daddy would be back. Marta feared the way the child would fold disappointment into the shape of a future habit. The water incident happened on the 18th day, and it changed the color of their experiment. There had been a small pool party at an upscale residence. Yasmin was there, resplendent, and the air smelled of sunscreen and cold drinks. A guest, more than a guest, a repeating presence in Yasmin's orbit, brought a bottle of bubbly to a group and, in a gesture meant to amuse, tossed the last drops like confetti. The drink flew through an arc and landed near Raphael, the pool cleaner who had been quietly moving, his head down as he worked. Yasmin, seeing the splash, laughed and made a small, casual motion with her hand. She was used to being at the center of action. Felipe echoed her laugh. In that small space, where reflex should have been courtesy, they treated Raphael as if he were part of the ambiance. A waiter tried to apologize. Raphael, calm and compact, brushed the water from his shirt and continued. Nobody offered a towel. The act was unremarkable to those present. Then, as if someone thought better of it, another guest, younger and eager to belong, picked up a glass and poured a little water onto Raphael's shoes. It was theatrical and cruel. A video clip of the moment would later spread. The arc of the water, Raphael's face as he looked up only to be met with laughter. It was a small, cheap thrill for the crowd. For Raphael it was part of a pattern, a reminder of his place. When Tiago watched the clip, he felt his hands close into fists before his mind stopped them. He had chosen not to be that kind of man, one who ruled with predictable violence, but he had to acknowledge that his absence had the potential to let patterns go unchallenged. He could not unsee how easy it was for refined people to treat work as scenery. That night he dreamed of Sophia walking through a city made only of elegant faces and small cruelties, and wondered what would happen to a child's soul that grew up smelling contempt. Marta felt unease like a coat. She had been with families of many kinds. She knew the small signals. How a hand rested on a child's shoulder when it needed correcting. How eyes scanned a room for threats. How a voice could be used to build or corrode. She started to notice little things Yasmin did at home. Not knowing bouquets of flowers were allergies, adjusting Sophia's clothes when no one saw, instructing the chef on what suitable food looked like for the child when the child liked simple things. Marta would watch Yasmin teaching Sophia to prefer the curated to be alone. On the 19th day, a turning point. A person lost her job because of Yasmin's whim. Luisa, the waiter who had been instructed away from her shifts, had come to a point where she could no longer let the indignity rest unremarked. She had a son in school and a mother relying on her wage. She had been a steady worker, and the loss of shifts meant a new strain. Tiago watched Luisa leave the restaurant with boxes in her hands, personal items folded like small confessions. She did not shout or beg. She folded what was hers and left. Later that night, Luisa sent a message to a friend. "I can't keep doing this. They laugh at me until I leave." The message, small and private, felt to Tiago like a bell. He counted the cost of a private cruelty. A job, a stable rhythm, sleep lost. He felt responsible in a way that was less an obligation and more a human ache. He began to see his experiment not only as a way to test Yasmin, but as a way to examine the structures that allowed her cruelty to be invisible and unpunished. He began to imagine, in a hazy blueprint, a different outcome. Policies that protected employees, voices that were amplified instead of muffled, small legal supports that would keep someone like Luisa from being disposable. But before he could build policy, someone else intervened. Marta came to him on the 20th day with a look that made the air thin. She had seen something, she said, and it had the weight of a confession. She did not immediately tell him what. She sat him down in the quiet kitchen that he had left days ago, and she spoke in the steady, low voice of someone who does not like surprises. "There are people afraid," she said simply. "People who won't say because of who you are. But Sophia needs—" She paused, and for a moment there was only the sound of the kettle. "Sophia needs to be raised with someone who knows mercy, not someone who thinks mercy is a look." Tiago watched Marta's face. He watched the muscles in her jaw work like a machine of fidelity. He had not expected Marta to do more than care. He had thought she would be the anchor in the household, not the one to bend the compass. "I've seen a message," Marta said, "from a girl who worked at the salon. She says that Yasmin pressured her until she left. She says the manager told her there was nothing to be done. She is scared to come forward because of Felipe." Tiago felt his plans tighten. Felipe's presence had been a constant, an enabler, a mirror, a man who liked the taste of showing he belonged. He had been the one to applaud small cruelties. He represented the social network that made Yasmin's actions harmless in the eyes of the privileged. Marta reached into her bag and produced something small. A file of messages collected, witnesses' names, a note where someone with a shaky handwriting had written the words, "I can't go back." She had done the work quietly, never asking for thanks, never wishing to be seen. She had collected stories and kept them in a paper folder like birds. "I can do more," she said simply. "I can talk to a few people. I can ask them if they will tell me what happened. But I won't harm the child. I won't put Sofia in danger." Tiago looked at the paper. He had planned to gather everything himself, to orchestrate an exposure that would make Yasmin visible for what she was. He had not expected Marta to take such a step, nor had he realized how much he needed someone to translate the small testimonies into something that could be seen as not only his truth, but a truth belonging to many. Marta's hands were steady as she placed the folder on the table. Her face was unreadable, and inside the unreadability was the sort of courage that takes shape in ordinary people. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "But if you make the truth a weapon, remember there will be people hurt. There will be consequences. We are not to make theater of other people's lives. We are to protect the child." Her words landed like a license and a restraint at once. Tiago thought about the consequences, about how public exposure could destroy careers, how it could ripple into violence, how it could also spark change. He was no naive man. He knew the ugliness that followed public shaming and the fragile line between accountability and vengeance. He had spent his life learning the recipes for both. Now, responsibility and power sat like two companions at his table. He took a breath and made an unspoken bargain. He would continue his observation for the small period he had set. He would trust Marta to protect Sofia. He would limit the use of what he had recorded to the smallest necessary context to protect his daughter, and to seek justice without cruelty as spectacle. That night, under a street lamp, he whispered to the little paper house folded inside his shirt, and promised Sofia, not just protection, but a home built from gentleness. He promised that if the world had to be hurt to become honest, he would be the one to take responsibility for the hurt. He promised that the people who had been invisible would not be used as props in a private war. And Marta, who had not asked for instructions or praise, left with the folder and a list of names. She would do what she knew how to do: gather testimony, protect the child, and decide when to step forward. On the 21st day, the calendar was down to a single square. Tiago's disguise felt heavier, like a costume worn long enough to leave its smell on the skin. He had seen enough to know he could not pretend ignorance anymore. He had proof. He had a line of witnesses. He had the image of Yasmin laughing while men poured water on a man's shoes like a game. The moral clarity was there in the shape of small lives he had seen bruised. The final day before he planned to return to the family was a heat that made the city's asphalt breathe in hot waves. Yasmin had arranged a small social event, a garden party where the city's elegant people would rotate like clockwork. It would be the perfect place to make everything public. She intended to be the center. He intended to make sure she could not pretend innocence when confronted with what she had done. What he did not expect was Marta's call in the evening. She had found something, she said. Something she thought he needed to see. There was a quality in her voice that did not ask for permission. Tiago listened as the sound of Marta's life made its ordinary anchors. The kettle, a child's laugh in the background, the rustle of napkins. He felt a sharp, small hope. "She brought me a message," Marta said, "from a woman at the salon. She says Yasmin threatened her when she wouldn't play along. But there's more. There are people who were ready to speak but were worried because of Felipe. They are willing if they are safe." Tiago's breath shortened in the way of a man brought close to the edge of a plan. He asked quietly, because his years taught him to make certain that plans had room for human restraint. "Is Sofia safe?" "She is safe," Marta said. "But tonight something else happened. A man at the garden party, someone new, tried to get too close to Sofia. He said he was a friend. He was hands-off, polite, but something about him was wrong. I moved between them. I asked him who he was. He backed away. I have his name." The revelation made the room tilt. Marta had prevented what could have been an immediate threat to the child. She had done something that required courage and presence. She had, in one motion, protected the child and rearranged the puzzle pieces Tiago had been aligning. The threat was no longer theoretical. Now the stakes were immediate. It was one thing to collect testimonies about contempt, another to protect a child from someone whose intentions might have been harmful. The protective motive that had driven Tiago's plan became sharper. It was no longer about moral education alone. It was about actual peril. "Bring me everything," Tiago said. "Names, times, anything they will give you. And hold Sofia close." Marta's response was not theatrical. It was the kind of simple yes that belonged to women who do not need permission to be brave. She promised to keep the child close and to deliver the folder to him at a moment only she would choose. The word impossible swirled in the air, but not as hyperbole. Marta's resources were small but precise: discretion, quiet force, and the willingness to stand in the line of danger. Tiago felt his plan leap toward confrontation and felt simultaneously the weight of what confrontation would do. He had a choice: expose, accelerate, or make the private justice that demanded less spectacle. He thought about the lives he would complicate, the careers that would be broken, the people who would find themselves in the crosshairs because truth had to be told. He looked at the little calendar on his cot. The last square gleamed like a promise. He folded the shirt he had worn that day and pressed it to his chest. He held the little paper house against his ribs and thought of how fragile a child's world could be, and how easily it could be rearranged. The city outside continued to move, indifferent and busy. Tiago felt the city's pulse in his own skin. He had made himself small to learn the shape of small people's lives. He had not expected to find himself dependent on Marta's small, decisive acts. He realized that protection, in the end, needs allies who are willing to do the quiet, dangerous things that are not recorded in the ledger books. He planned the reveal in his head like a man drawing a map. He imagined a place where the truth could be seen, and where the consequences would be fair and not vindictive. He imagined a finality that was rooted not in spectacle, but in accountability. He told himself again that he would not let the exposure become entertainment. If he could choose the terms, he would choose restorative measures afterward: jobs resecured, apologies that meant something, structural changes to prevent the same pattern of dismissiveness. Marta would be the one to hand him the last piece. He did not yet know how she would do it. He only knew that she had stepped into an impossible place and emerged with names and threats and a folder that weighed like an ethical decision. She had salvaged the immediate danger to Sofia, and in doing so, she had become central to the plan he had set in motion. On the night before his return, Tiago sat at a small table with the city's lights distant like low fires. He pressed the paper house to his face and felt the crisp paper rub his cheek. He thought of all the small faces he had seen during his weeks he had worn a stranger's hands and a stranger's coat to learn what being unseen felt like. He had counted windows where people looked away, catalogued half-smiles that softened into cruelty, and learned the names of those who vanished at the first sign of trouble. He thought of their faces: the janitor's quiet dignity, Louisa folding her life into boxes, Raphael standing with wet shoes and an uncomplaining mouth, and felt the measure of what he had done and what he might still do. The morning of the garden party was hot, as if the city had been ironed. Tiago left his cot with the paper house pressed to his chest and walked to the rendezvous where Marta had asked him to meet. He shed the janitor's cap in a public restroom and folded the uniform into the smallest possible packet, the gesture both ritual and farewell. He changed into the clothes he had left behind for when the truth needed face. He felt the weight of his power settle differently now. It was only useful if it did not swallow the people it was meant to protect. Marta was there before him, standing by a low wall beneath a lemon tree, hands tucked into an old cardigan despite the heat. She had the folder of testimonies under her arm and a face that asked nothing of pity. She looked at him like someone who had been given a map and had memorized the hard parts. "You have what you need?" he asked quietly. "Enough," she said. "And something else." She opened the folder and pulled out a small folded note. It was a message from a former salon worker who had been too frightened to speak when her livelihood depended on the smiles of others. The note contained names, times, a short account written with brave, shaking letters. Marta had written the worker's name at the top and the words, "I will come with you," at the bottom. She had promised to be present if the woman decided to speak. Marta's voice was low. "She will be here, Tiago. She wants to be heard by people who can make a change." They walked together toward the party, their steps measured, their faces blank masks. Tiago's plan was not to create a tribunal of cruelty for entertainment. He had promised himself, and Marta, that whatever happened would aim at repair. He wanted the public to see what had been happening, but he also wanted a path forward for those damaged by it. At the gate, a man stopped them, an acquaintance of Tiago's, brief, glossy, the type who smiled at invitations and sought reflections of his own name. He fell into habit. A handshake, a clipped question about health. Tiago kept his voice even. He felt every eye slide and return without finding his face interesting. It was the kind of power that made others perform. Marta slipped inside with her folder and slid into the staff area like a shadow. She had told Tiago she would keep Sofia away until it was safe, and the child was with the chef's sister down the lane, eating an extra scoop of ice cream and making the world right with sticky fingers. Tiago felt relief every second he imagined his daughter's back to whatever she loved at the moment. A coloring page, a giggle, a spoon clanking in a small bowl. He had promised not to put her in harm's way. She would not be witness to the spectacle. Her world would be protected by Marta's steady hands. The garden was arranged in tiers of taste. Linen napkins, low tables, people whose names meant something, and people whose names meant more. Yasmin moved like light itself, elegant, rehearsed, used to being the temperature of a room. Felipe hovered nearby, a man who had always been ready to applaud. They greeted guests with curated intimacy. It looked like every other event where the city forgot the others who made the moment smooth. Tiago took a seat near the center but kept his eyes on the edges. He felt a hum of nerves like the aftertaste of a cigarette, the kind he had not indulged in for many years. He had planned, with help, a projection of sorts to play during the toast, a sequence of the incidents he had collected over the 3 weeks. It would not be framed as an accusation alone, but as a record. The clip would cut without commentary, faces, words, gestures, because the images themselves carried the weight. Marta returned to him before the toast began. She had the woman from the salon at her elbow, eyes wide and determined. Marta introduced the woman, Livia, with a soft gravity. Livia's voice was small at first. She held herself like a person who had rehearsed the confidence of someone else's life. Tiago could see she was terrified of the attention, but she had decided, by force of small courage, to speak for a truth that had been cheapened. The host called for a toast. Tiago stood. He felt the room still as if someone had asked time to hold its breath. He planned to speak, but when his words began, Marta interrupted in the kindest way possible. She stepped forward and said plainly, "Before anyone raises a glass, there are things we need to remember about the people who stand behind our comfort." Her voice did not tremble. It carried like a bell. The room, so used to polite choreography, did not know how to respond. Marta did not want praise. She wanted attention turned toward the small deaths that happen when kindness is an accessory. She asked the host respectfully if a screen could be used for something that matters. The host, expecting perhaps a charity clip, nodded, and a man with a tablet fiddled under her direction. Marta did not step into the limelight. She stayed near Tiago, and careful hands played the first clip. The images began. Yasmin at the sidewalk, the word landing like a stone. The gym where a trainer's aspirations were scorned. The salon where a stylist's hands trembled after a whispered insult. There were close-ups of faces. Luisa, folding her life into boxes. Raphael drenched with the cheap thrill of others' laughter. The sound was raw, laughs, the snapping edge of a sentence, a small voice apologizing. The garden dissolved into a stillness so dense it was almost audible. The projection cut to the pool clip. Water arcing, a man blinking as liquid fell, the echo of laughter that sounded small and mean. There was a ripple in the audience like wind across tall grass. Cameras lifted as if to see what had happened. Some phones recorded. Some faces went pale. Yasmin rose first, the motion tiny, controlled. Her smile faltered. She had never been confronted with movement that was not scripted. Felipe moved closer as if to shade her. Guests shifted, and some who had admired Yasmin's shine now found themselves searching for a different light. Then Marta did the impossible. She stepped forward and, with measured words, offered a voice to those projected images. She introduced the woman from the salon, Livia, and invited her to speak, not as a spectacle, but as a human asking to be recognized. Livia spoke of being asked to laugh at other people, of being made complicit in jokes that left her ashamed. Her words were plain and clean and cut through the varnish of the room. She named the manner in which people like Yasmin used contempt as pastime. She told of the manager who had dismissed her after a public shaming and the months of savings gone. She spoke not for revenge, but for dignity. When she finished, the sound that rose from the garden was complicated. Some applause, some silence, a few indignant coughs. Yasmin's face was a study in unraveling poise. She had been raised to command applause, not to answer for the small cruelties that made applause possible. Marta did one more thing that had not been part of Tiago's plan. She produced a short stack of messages, simple screenshots, names, times, collected from people who had been too afraid to speak alone. She presented them to the assembled guests and asked them to listen. She asked those in positions of power, family members, employers, organizers, to consider what it meant to be bystanders. Her voice did not wag a finger. It merely lifted the burden from the shoulders of those who had been ignored. Later, when asked how she had found the courage, she would say that courage was not a grand thing for her. It was fidelity to a child's life and common decency. In that moment, she stood like a person who had chosen an ethical life over the comfort of silence. To those watching, it felt like an act both humble and radical. Yasmin tried to speak after Livia's account, to frame things as misunderstandings, to offer clipped apologies that sounded rehearsed. Felipe attempted to reframe the narrative by attacking the messenger, questioning motives, hinting at the idea that this was an arranged spectacle. Tiago watched Felipe's mouth turn into the old mechanics of deflection. It would have been expected for the room to defend its own. But Marta's courage had shifted something in the air. People who had been merely observers were forced to reckon with what they had enjoyed. Tiago stepped forward then, not to mete out vengeance, but to give direction. He did not want the moment to become a public execution. He wanted repair. He told the guests plainly that those who had been harmed would be offered immediate restitution. He instructed the event organizers to open lines of communication for the employees who had been hurt, to rehire where appropriate, to compensate for lost wages, and to fund training that would protect workers from being subject to capricious dismissals. He did not make these decrees as a lord demanding obedience. He made them as someone acknowledging that his power had been used and would now be used to repair. There was a chorus of responses. Some gathered signatures to an urgent petition. One of Yasmin's friends, a woman who had benefited from seeing the world only through a glossy lens, apologized in the small way people can when the ground under their feet shifts. A hotel manager promised to review staff policies. Yasmin's own reaction was complex. She apologized in a way that sought to compress consequence into ceremony. Flowers, a short note. But the public could see the mismatch between her apology and the small wounds she had caused. She attempted to explain, to make her cruelty seem like ignorance rather than choice. Some believed her, others did not. Tiago felt no joy to see her withdrawal. He felt only the ache of necessary accountability. He could not erase what had been done to Luisa or Rafael. He could only insist that the people who had been made small be reconstituted in some measure. Felipe, furious and exposed, tried to make himself thunderous, to accuse Tiago of manipulation. He suggested that Tiago had engineered the entire scene, that the janitor disguise had been drama fit for a film. Tiago allowed the accusation to hang, and then answered in a low voice that carried to the potted plants at the edge of the room. This is not a performance. This is a record. He refused to become a spectacle maker. He insisted that the focus shift to the people who had been harmed, not on him or the theatrics that had been used to reveal them. There were murmurs that spread later, that a leader in the city had somehow staged the exposure. But the witnesses would confirm the small things. Marta's folder, Livia's presence, the workers' signatures. The stories were not a single orchestrated trick. They were many small truths agreeing. After the event, Tiago met privately with several of those who had lost wages. He offered compensation quietly and asked nothing in return. He opened a fund that would pay back wages and institute a small stipend for those whose careers had been derailed. He used his network to find positions for Luisa and Rafael at other establishments that valued their dignity. He created with careful counsel a program in partnership with local organizations to teach employers about worker rights and provide anonymous channels for complaints that would not cost someone their job. Marta had been present through all of it, steady as a harbor. No one clapped for her in the big way. People clapped for her only in the small, true ways. An embrace from Livia, a whispered thank you from a chef who had watched quiet courage and felt seen. Tiago called her aside and placed a small envelope in her hand that contained more than money. It had an offer of better pay, a contract, and the promise of a supportive role where she would be entrusted with Sophia's welfare and have direct access to resources. He said, "You did what I could not plan for," and she touched his hand as if touching an old friend. Marta's impossible act had been two things at once. She had protected Sophia in the immediate moment when a stranger's intentions raised alarms, and she had brought the last piece of the puzzle that made the story undeniable. She had gathered the voices that feared the wealthy's retribution, and had offered them a stage that did not become their execution. She had done so without turning lives into amusement. For Tiago, it was a quiet salvation, the knowledge that the person who watched his child would not be silent when the world needed to be accountable. There were practical consequences, too. The hotel where the pool incident occurred instituted a review and reinstated Rafael with compensation. The restaurant that had dismissed Luisa found itself under public scrutiny and rehired her with an apology. The salon where a stylist had been mocked underwent staff training and a structural policy change that aimed to prevent managers from letting client preferences dissolve into discriminatory firings. The changes were not perfect, they were not cures. But they were steps, and Tiago invested both money and influence to turn those steps into durable shifts. A fund for workers who could not immediately recoup lost wages, a hotline run by a non-profit that promised anonymity and legal counsel, and a small board that included representatives of service workers to advise local events on etiquette and fair treatment. Yasmin's life after the reveal fractured in ways public and private. Social invitations receded. Some of her friends left, embarrassed by association. Others stayed, hoping the scandals would pass like storms. She released an apologetic statement that many judged insufficient. She requested private forgiveness from the family. She met Tiago one afternoon in a quiet room where, for once, there was nowhere for an audience to watch. She tried to explain herself, to fold the moments into a narrative that softened culpability. Tiago listened with a kind of exhausted patience. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said at one point, voice thin. "I grew up thinking refinement required a kind of distance. I didn't see." "You did," Tiago replied, and his voice was the sort that measured. "You saw. You chose contempt. It was a choice." She cried then, not so much for public embarrassment as for the loss of a life that had been built on admiration. There was regret in her tears, but regret did not change the months Luisa had spent worrying about school fees. Nor did it restore the dignity Rafael had been denied on a hot day. Tiago did not savor her ruin. He only held the basic fact of harm, that people had been damaged and needed restitution and structural change. The family fractured in private ways. Sofia, shielded from the spectacle, felt the tremor indirectly. A new quiet in the house, conversations that stopped when she stepped into the room, Marta's eyes carrying the weight of events. Tiago tried to keep her childhood as unbroken as possible. He read her stories tucked in the same fading chair, made paper boats with new jokes, and when Sofia asked why some people were unkind, he told her simply, "Some people forget to be kind. We make sure we remember." Months passed, and the viral fever cooled into a more functional attention. Investigations by heads of committees, civil suits, and a handful of people publicly supporting the workers who had been hurt. The media wanted a narrative of dramatic fall and equally dramatic redemption. Tiago refused to feed that appetite. He refused interviews that cast him as a theatrical avenger. He gave two public statements. One was a brief, carefully measured explanation about why truth mattered and why power should be used to construct rather than to command. The second was an invitation to the city to build structures that protect workers. He used the distance he had cultivated to redirect attention away from a single-man spectacle and toward longer-term solutions. There were consequences for Tiago, too. The revelation that a prominent, feared man had gone undercover created a strain of gossip about methods and intentions. Some accused him of manipulation, others thanked him. He took both claims with the same steady face and continued the work he had started. Not vengeance, but reparation. He was not immune to inner reckoning. He had spent weeks pretending to be small and experienced, intimately, how it felt to be unseen. He could not unfeel it. That sensation shaped his decisions after the event. He met with community organizers and workers in a small hall that smelled of coffee and detergent and human resolve. He listened more than he spoke. He learned the practicalities of job security for low-paid workers, the way schedules were used to cut pay, how client preferences could be weaponized, the small legal loopholes that allowed dismissals without recourse. He funded quietly and with counsel, legal aid programs and training for events and hospitality businesses. He set up a small trust that paid for emergency wages where people had been let go without cause. He insisted that the trust be administered by a committee that included workers themselves so that decisions would not be the province of him or his peers. Marta declined any public pedestal. She asked for no medal. She accepted, with a reserve she could not hide, better pay and a contract that recognized her as a trusted guardian. She took the job with a quiet, practical generosity. She cared for Sofia and became a liaison between the household and the programs that Tiago had funded. She remained, as always, the steady center of the little world she kept together. Yasmin attempted, in private, to be present in ways that tried to be sincere. She attended a few of the training sessions Tiago funded, listened awkwardly as workers described what dignity meant to them, and sometimes offered small, clumsy apologies. For some, it was enough. For others, it was not. The important truth was that remorse, when it arrived, did not instantly make recompense perfect. Restoration, Tiago had learned, asked for work beyond contrition. Felipe found his social map altered, alliances shifted. He tried to repair his image with people who wanted reconciliation, but for many his role in the mockery was too visible. He learned that social currency could evaporate quickly when built on another's humiliation. Months later, at a modest event for which Tiago refused the spotlight, the mayor announced a directive that required event organizers to produce fair employment guidelines for staff working in hospitality and domestic service at events. It was not a law that solved everything, but it was a system-level change, a formal recognition that spectacles require stagehands who are human beings, deserving of contractual protections. Tiago did not claim credit in the public announcement. He was present in the back of the room, a quiet man with a small knot of grief and a larger knot of resolve. He understood that influence must be wielded with restraint, and he tried to live that way. In the days and weeks that followed, small restitutions took root. Luisa found a steady position and, with the help of the trust, enrolled in a course that allowed her to move into management. Rafael received not only his lost wages, but a scholarship that allowed him to learn pool maintenance with a certification. Livia, the salon worker, began to teach classes about customer management and dignity, a program funded by the trust that aimed to make salons safe places to work and to speak. They were not grand transformations, but to each person they were tangible repairs, practical stitches on small wounds. The public watched and then turned its attention elsewhere, as it always does, but in private rooms lives improved. Tiago would visit occasionally, not to be seen but to check that the money had been used well, to talk to managers and community leaders, to remind them that the work of dignity is mundane and ongoing, and that it requires consistent pressure, not only the flash of outrage. He found himself, unexpectedly, in the middle of a set of human relationships he had not planned to cultivate. He had thought he would return, make a clean cut, and resume an old shape of life. Instead, he found that once you had seen the small invisible faces of the city, you could not bear to move as if they did not exist. There were nights, too, when he was honest in the small mirror of his kitchen. He did not try to make his actions into moral absolution. He had done morally complicated things. He had used means that, in other hands, could become instruments of cruelty. He had broken his own rules to learn the truth, and had asked Marta to stand inside the hard moments. He slept with the knowledge that even acts meant to protect can leave bruises. He kept counseling and legal advice close as he navigated the fallout, refusing to allow his personal universe to be governed by vindictive impulses. Sophia learned about kindness in ways that came out of the changes around her. She learned to invite neighborhood children to play in the garden, to say thank you to the chef for extra soup that had no audience, to fold a note of thanks and put it in the staff break room. She learned that being protected did not mean being separated from the world. Tiago watched her small, patient kindness and felt true relief that what he had done had not sealed her away from the breadth of life. On a quiet afternoon, months after the event, Tiago walked the neighborhood where he had once been the janitor with a disguise. He carried nothing but a small token, the paper house he had folded on the night he left his daughter's drawing on his chest. He had kept it, not as a relic of a strange plan, but as a reminder of what had moved him to act. He walked to a small square where a mural had been painted, a public art project funded by the trust, depicting people in many colors working together. A chef, a cleaner, a child with a kite. The mural had been proposed by one of the women Tiago had met, a way to make permanence of an idea that usually flickered. There, on a bench nearby, Marta sat knitting. She glanced up and he sat beside her. For a long while they said nothing. The city hummed around them in its ordinary indifference, and that indifference had been what they had tried to change. "You did the impossible," he said finally. Marta did not smile like someone who sought praise. "I did what needed to be done," she answered. "You did what you had to do for your daughter. We fixed some things." "We fixed some things," he repeated. The voice had no show of triumph. "And we broke others." "Sometimes to rebuild, something must fall apart," she said. "But rebuilding is slow, and it must be honest." He handed her the paper house. "For the garden," he said. "Maybe they can paint it somewhere." Marta took it and folded it carefully, as if it were a small creature that could be comforted by careful hands. "We will find a place," she said. "But remember, never let the child think that the world is always kind. Teach her to be kind. Teach her how to protect without destroying." He nodded. He promised again, a promise that was not heroic, but parental and steady. He did what parents do. He tried to shape the future bit by bit. Later, alone in his study, Tiago reflected on what the weeks had revealed. He had known, intellectually, the cost of being unseen. Having felt it, he could not, in good conscience, return to a life that ignored it. The city had taught him small lessons, how small cruelties accumulate, how dignity can be legislated in tiny increments, how policies can be shaped by those who understand the lives of workers. Yet he also knew that no policy or trust could rewrite the private harms done to a woman who lost a job or a man who was made spectacle. There would be apologies. Some would be sincere, some performative. Justice would not be a single event. He sat at his desk, looking at a letter from one of the workers thanking him. It was not an exaltation of his methods, so much as a practical note about how their life had shifted. That was enough, in a way. It gave him the sense his influence had been turned to something that mattered beyond his own comfort. On a winter morning, with the city gray and soft, Tiago walked with Sofia to a small community class that taught children how to draw and share. She took his hand and, for a moment, leaned into him in a way that asked for the security that is the unremarkable work of parenthood. He felt the breadth of that small chest that leaned against his side, and knew that whatever he had done, good, flawed, necessary, had been for this, to keep her safe in the world and to teach her to see others. The public page on the scandal cooled into a series of articles about governance and the ethics of influence. Some commentators praised Marta and those who had spoken. Others debated whether Tiago's means were justified by his ends. He did not respond to the debates. He continued the work quietly. The trust, regular community meetings, listening sessions where he sat in chairs that were not reserved for his head of household. He learned humility the hard way, by listening, by making mistakes, and by allowing others to make the decisions that affected them. As seasons shifted, the garden where the mural had been painted became a place where workers and families met. Food trucks served modest dishes, a table offered free books, children chased kites. Tiago would sometimes sit on the edge and watch, content in a small way that the world was a little more just because of ordinary people making ordinary choices. Marta became a point of contact in the neighborhood for many who needed help balancing work and life. She had a small office with a chair and a plant, and a list of phone numbers. She accepted invitations to speak at training sessions, always with a modest comfort that refused grandstanding. Tiago gave her the legal protections and pay she deserved, and she used them to keep watching, true to the steady role that had saved his daughter and kept others from being invisible. There were nights when he walked alone and remembered the janitor's cap and the way anonymity had felt like an onion of small exposures. He had entered that life to learn and had been born to a new kind of responsibility. Power, he understood, was not a right to command, but an obligation to repair. Years later, when Sofia was older and learned the contours of the story, Tiago did not try to wrap it in easy explanations. He told her the truth in measured parts, that he had feared for her, that he had seen people treated small, and that he had chosen to act. He told her that Marta had been the one who had stepped forward when others had not, and he taught her to value the small, dependable acts that build a life. He never dramatized the humiliation that had started it all. He taught instead the body of work that had followed, restitution, structures, and a commitment to dignity. In the end, the scandal had not rewritten everyone. Some people changed. Some learned to be kinder. Others retreated into their lives with a new caution. Yasmin found that not all doors opened for her anymore, and sometimes, in quiet hours, she visited the training sessions and listened. She tried to be different, and whether she succeeded was not for Tiago to pronounce. He only knew that forgiveness, if it came, must be earned, and that redemption did not erase consequence. The city had moved on in public, as cities do. But in small rooms and modest kitchens, conversation had shifted. Waiters who had been expected to swallow insults now carried with them the quiet knowledge that there were pockets of power willing to protect their well-being. Training programs, a small fund, and a hotline were modest victories, but they altered, if only by degrees, the architecture of how people treated one another. On a quiet afternoon years later, Tiago stood at the mural in the garden with Sofia and Marta. He placed the paper house into a small glass case built into the mural's base, a simple act of memorializing a decision made in a night of fear and love. He looked at Marta and Sofia, and then at the people who lingered in the square, chefs, cleaners, parents, children. They were ordinary people making ordinary choices, and that ordinariness felt sacred. He had not sought redemption for himself. He had sought protection for his child, and dignity for those who had been invisible. He had found that protection often required risk, and that dignity sometimes had to be insisted upon with uncomfortable methods. He had learned that exposing cruelty could help spark systemic change, but that such exposure had to be handled with care, for the people harmed were never props in a lesson. He rested his hand lightly on Marta's shoulder, and, for a moment, let himself be a man who had done a hard thing and was learning the slow work of repair. He felt the small paper house under his palm and thought of the child's drawings, the folded paper boats, the jokes tucked into lunchboxes. He understood, with the quiet horror and beauty of a man who has seen both light and shadow, that the work of parenting and the work of justice are often the same, continual, patient, and imperfect. As they walked home, Sophia skipping ahead and Marta humming a tune she had always sung, Tiago felt something he had not known he would feel so plainly. Not triumph, but a kind of relief that was tied to responsibility. A relief that comes when you stop pretending the world owes you nothing and start paying attention to the small ledgers of human dignity. If this story moved you or made you think about the cost of being unseen, leave a comment. Do people truly change, or only when exposed? Share your thoughts. There are lessons here worth talking about.